Hello, I'm William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in this video I'd like to begin walking students of all ages through the study of Aristotle's Art of Rhetoric. As we go through this course, I'd like to just say that the entire text in English translation of Aristotle's Rhetoric is available for free on the Classical Liberal Arts Academy website. So if you'd like to follow along in the text as we go through these lessons, I recommend you pause the video, go find the text, and then start the video back up once you're ready to go. We're in Chapter 1 of Aristotle's Art of Rhetoric. Before we get started, I'd like to address a common misunderstanding about the art of rhetoric. Many people think of rhetoric as the art of persuasion. They think of rhetoric as something that one learns and uses in order to persuade other people, to make people do their will. We think of salesmen or people in advertising, and we think that rhetoric is sort of the study of all of the tricks that need to be learned to cause other people to do what we want them to do or think what we want them to think. And that is not what the art of rhetoric is. It's important to understand, first of all, that when we study an ancient philosopher like Aristotle, he assumes that we're already interested in being good men. He assumes that we're already studying the science of moral philosophy, that we're seeking to learn how to live well, how to live virtuously, how to live honestly, how to seek the truth and pursue wisdom. After all, that's the purpose of philosophy. So the art of rhetoric would never be presented to men who are merely trying to do their own will and force others to do what they want them to do. So the art of rhetoric is not a study where we learn how to make other people do what we want them to do. Secondly, human beings are rational creatures, but they also have free will, and they're also inclined to sin. People are often judged according to the effects of their message or speaking and the response of the audience to their message. But the test of a true rhetorician, the test of a master of the art of rhetoric, is not the response of the crowd or a person with whom someone is speaking. The response of another person is never the test of effective rhetoric. A good example of this can be found in God himself. We look at the world and we find that billions of people live in denial of the existence of God. Billions of people do not worship God by faith, hope, and charity. Billions of people are not members of the Catholic Church. And so if we were to judge the speaker based on the reaction of his audience, we would have to conclude that God is one of the worst orators to ever exist, one of the worst of all rhetoricians, that he possesses no wisdom with regard to the art of rhetoric. But that's obviously ridiculous. Human beings are rational creatures, but they have free will, and they also are sinful, and they very often choose to act contrary to what they know to be true. Even though they know something is true, they won't do it. You can find this explained, if you'd like to study this a bit, in Romans chapter 1 in the New Testament. Towards the end of Romans 1, I think starting in verse 18 or so, there's a discussion of fallen people. St. Paul was specifically talking about non-Jews who lived in the world and who were filled with all kinds of sinful habits and perverted ways of life. And the question we might ask is, are these people guilty? These people don't live in Israel. These people didn't have the scriptures. These people didn't live in the presence of patriarchs and prophets and apostles. Christ himself didn't come to visit these Gentile people. So are they guilty of their sinful activities? And St. Paul argued that yes, they are guilty, And he says in Romans chapter 1, because what can be known of God is known to them. What can be known of God is known to them, for God has manifested it to them, so they are without excuse. However, St. Paul goes on to say, but they have suppressed the truth in unrighteousness. And this is the problem with men and women, is that we often know what's true. We have the truth manifested to us. We're shown what's right, and we suppress the knowledge of the truth because of our unrighteousness. And so just because someone doesn't respond well to a speaker doesn't mean that that speaker hasn't effectively communicated his position in a persuasive manner. So I want to make these 2 points before we get started, because many people enter into the study of rhetoric with a wrong idea about what rhetoric is. Rhetoric, like all of the arts to be pursued in the pursuit of wisdom, are intended first of all for men who are interested in being good, virtuous people. That's concern number 1. Men who are concerned with truth and virtue. And secondly, the responses of an audience are not the test of effective rhetoric. The art itself is the measure of one's effectiveness. The art itself is the measure of one's mastery. And so as we learn the art, we use the art to assess whether or not we've communicated effectively. And the master of the art of rhetoric is a man who, as we'll see in Aristotle's text, effectively employs all of the available means of persuasion in his communication. So we can only know what good rhetoric is after we've learned the art of rhetoric, and then use the art and principles of the art of rhetoric to judge whether or not we have fulfilled our objectives and done the best we can, whether we fulfilled our duty to communicate to others what's true and left them with no excuse. Okay, so I hope that's a helpful introduction before we get started, to avoid anyone entering into this study with wrong motives. This isn't intended to be a course that teaches you how to get more sales at work or how to persuade someone to go on a date with you. That's not what rhetoric is for. Rhetoric is the art by which we learn to present what's true to others in the most credible manner possible, and having done so, understand that our duty is fulfilled as communicators. So, having said that, let's get into the study of Aristotle's Art of Rhetoric. We're beginning in Book 1, Chapter 1. And my intention for these videos is simply to walk students through the reading and try to help them through their first reading and explain any points that I know students have a difficult time with, whether it's a matter of vocabulary or ideas that come from other arts and sciences which Aristotle refers to. I'd like to try to clarify those things so that students can successfully read through each chapter and study the art of rhetoric. So let's begin in chapter 1 of book 1. And I'll keep a note up here on the board just of important vocabulary or terms we come across. First of all, this is the art of rhetoric. The art of rhetoric, one of the 3 arts of the ancient trivium. And we'll see that these 3 arts of grammar, reasoning, and rhetoric are inseparable. They all inform and influence one another. And if you're going to pursue mastery in the art of rhetoric, you also need to be studying the arts of grammar and reasoning, as well as the philosophical sciences like moral philosophy. We'll get into all that as we go along in this study. So chapter 1, let's read through and discuss the first chapter in Aristotle's Rhetoric. Aristotle writes, rhetoric reciprocates with dialectic. Rhetoric reciprocates with dialectic. And this word dialectic, which I'm not going to get into too much at this point, dialectic is simply a synonym for logic or reasoning. However, when you study the art of reasoning, you're going to learn that dialectical reasoning is just one kind of reasoning. There are a number of kinds of reasoning. Actually, Aristotle says that there are 4 different kinds of arguments. Dialectical arguments are one kind of argument, and you're going to learn of others. So when Aristotle uses this term dialectic, he can be using it just to refer to reasoning in general, or he could be referring specifically to dialectical reasoning. And just so you know, if you go to Aristotle's works on reasoning, the Organon, where he teaches the entire art and science of reasoning, the book that teaches dialectical reasoning is the Topics. So if you're interested in dialectical reasoning and understanding what that means, the place to study that is in the book titled The Topics, and he'll refer to that in this work on rhetoric. So, rhetoric reciprocates with dialectic or reasoning. Rhetoric and reasoning are related to one another, they influence one another, they inform one another, and they're inseparable. You cannot study rhetoric without also studying the art of reasoning. They reciprocate because both are conversant with such particulars as being common may after a manner be known by all men and pertain to no definite science. So the reason why rhetoric and dialectic are similar, why they reciprocate, why they have something in common, is because they're not like mechanical arts. We might look at a carpenter or a shipbuilder or a horse trainer, and we may see these different arts being studied and practiced as specialties. Rhetoric is not like one of those arts, just like reasoning is not like those arts. Those particular arts, or definite sciences, as Aristotle says, are studied only by those who work in those fields. Rhetoric and reasoning, however, are of interest to all men. They're of interest to all human beings because we all do the work that's studied in rhetoric and reasoning, no matter what our actual vocation or specific occupation may be. They are known by all men and they pertain to no definite science. They are of general interest to all men. So who should study the art of rhetoric? Everyone. Who should study the art of reasoning? All human beings, because these things are human or of human interest, these classical liberal arts. All men, in a certain respect, participate of both these. For all men, to a certain extent, endeavor to examine and sustain an argument, to defend and to accuse. These are human activities. As rational creatures, we do these things from the time we're little toddlers. We argue and we fight and we reason and we defend ourselves and accuse. We engage in all of this rational, persuasive argumentation because we're human beings and we're gifted with the faculty of reasoning from birth. We're not like lions. Lions would settle all of their disputes by fighting, by violence. We're not lions. They're not rational creatures. Human beings settle their conflicts primarily by means of reasoning. The only time when human beings resort to violence is when someone is not willing to listen to reason or be persuaded. And then, for the sake of the common good, we may need to exercise violence because those men acting contrary to reason can only be controlled by means of force. But normally and preferably, we settle our conflicts as human beings by means of arguing and reasoning with one another. With respect to the multitude, that is, common men, men in the street, the common people, the multitude. With respect to the multitude, some of them do these things casually or by chance. Some of them do these things casually. but others through custom from habit. Some do them casually, some do them from custom through habit. And this is simple to understand. When he says from custom through habit, what he means is that these activities, defending, accusing, examining and sustaining arguments, some people do these things accidentally. They just get lucky. They make a good argument, but they really don't understand why it's a good argument. And 2 minutes later, they may make a terrible argument and prove that the argument isn't coming from some kind of wisdom that they possess, but they just got lucky and happened to make a good argument. You'll even see people sometimes surprised by what comes out of their mouth because it's smart and they really didn't conceive of that argument. It just sort of happened and ideas came together and something smart came out. 2 minutes later, something ridiculous may come out. Some people argue effectively by chance. Others, however, do it more habitually. Others can argue effectively as a matter of habit. That is, they know what it feels like to argue effectively, and they can produce good arguments at will. They learn this by developing habits that come through custom. And what Aristotle is referring to here is education and experience. So, for example, if a child is raised in a family where conflicts and controversies and problems are handled in a wise and effective and orderly manner. Let's say dad calls the family together, sits down at the dinner table, and the family discusses problems, and they settle problems together carefully, patiently, reasonably, through discussions. Those children will grow up and know what it feels like to resolve conflicts by means of discussion. They'll know what to do, not because they've studied an art of reasoning, but because they've learned it by custom. They've learned it by experience, by simply being raised in an environment where those things were practiced. And so some people can make an effective argument or make an effective, persuasive accusation by chance. They can't do it a second time. They just get lucky. Others, by experience and by education, learn to do these things in a habitual way because they're raised and learn to do them through custom or through education. Okay, so that's what Aristotle explains there. And he says this is important because since these things can be accomplished by habit through custom, that means that there are principles that can be studied and drawn out and turned into a system or art. And therefore, because we can see people who learn through custom from habit to argue effectively, that gives us the confidence that an art can be formed with regard to this argumentation. If we could only find people who do these things by chance, then there would be no evidence that it could be turned into an art and studied and practiced scientifically by people as an art. An example of this might be found in sports. Let's say we have a couple of kids and they're throwing balls, and we see that one kid throws so much faster than the other two kids. I grew up with a kid who went on to become a pro pitcher, who when we were 6 years old, 7 years old, he threw the ball so hard that he wasn't allowed to pitch on the pitcher's mound. The umpires actually made him stand behind the pitcher's mound because he threw so hard that it was dangerous for the other kids. He did that when he was 7 years old. It was just natural for him. He didn't know the art of pitching. He didn't know anything about mechanics of how to use his body to increase the velocity of his pitching. He just did it. He just went out there and winged it and the ball flew out of his hand fast as a little kid, and he continued to be a great player as we grew up. Whereas there are other kids who want to be pitchers, don't do that, and have to actually study the mechanics of how to throw the ball, how to get the most velocity on the pitch, and so on. But we don't know if it can be learned until someone proves that the same results can be achieved without that natural, good luck or just natural instinct, but also by an orderly, habitual training and study. So when we see that someone can reproduce the same effects by means of principles and study, then we know that we have an art that can be studied and taught. And this is true of argumentation. All right. Because this is possible in both ways, by chance and by habit, it is evident that these particulars may be reduced to a certain method. And that word method means art. For it is possible to survey the cause why some men render what they assert probable from custom and others from chance. But all men now will acknowledge that a thing of this kind is a work of art, a method that can be studied and practiced and successfully repeated. That's what an art is. Aristotle then goes on in this second paragraph to talk about what's wrong with the attempts that men have made in his generation to teach this art of persuasion. And we'll see that what men did in his day that was wrong is the same thing that men do in our day. And I'll talk about that in a bit. So what Aristotle says is at present, that is in the 4th century before Christ, let's say before 350 BC, at present, those who compose the arts of orations or speech-making. An oration is simply a speech. Those who compose arts of orations, that is, who unfold the art of rhetoric, explain only a small part of rhetoric. That is, we're not to confuse the art of oration making or public speaking. We're not to confuse public speaking with the art of rhetoric. The art of rhetoric is much broader. And so his criticism is that men in his day were only concerned with making speeches and learning how to make a speech. This is the same error we see in our day, where if you go to a local school or college, you'll find courses that are called public speaking or introduction to public speaking. And all they're concerned with is teaching students how to stand in front of an audience and speak in public. And usually the issue is that the students aren't comfortable speaking in public. And the reason why they're not comfortable is not because they're ugly or they're dressed funny or anything. It's because they don't know if what they're going to say is actually intelligent and persuasive. They don't know because they don't know the actual art of rhetoric. And therefore, they cannot stand in front of an audience and speak confidently because they know before they even go out onto that stage or stand in front of that audience that what they're going to say is true and is demonstrable and is persuasive. They don't know the art of persuasiveness, the art of true rhetoric, and therefore they can't be confident in what they're going to say. And so these modern public speaking courses will not address the real problem or the cause of the children's lack of confidence. What they'll do is try to puff the students up and teach them just to be confident and to speak confidently. And they'll teach them all of these psychological tricks and things like that to try to make them stand up and speak as if every word that comes out of their mouth is true. And that's just some kind of delusion. If we're not confident, we want to know what the cause of that lack of confidence is and deal with it in a real way. If I'm not confident because I know that I really don't know anything about this topic, and I have no idea if what I'm going to say is going to, be capable of persuading an audience, well, then I walk out onto stage without confidence. Or, as I said earlier, if I don't really understand what my responsibility is as a speaker, and I'm expecting some result that's not in my control, I'm going to lack confidence and be uncertain because I don't understand what I'm even trying to do or what the goal of my speech even is. And those are problems that can only be dealt with by actually studying and learning the true art of rhetoric. And that was Aristotle's criticism of arts of oration or arts of rhetoric that were composed in his day. They were too shallow and superficial. They were either just concerned with public speaking, or they were just concerned with manipulating audiences. And we'll see what that means later in this study. He says, credibility is the only artificial part of this art. Credibility is the only artificial part of this art. What does that mean? Credibility is the only artificial part of this art. Now, in modern society, unfortunately, when we hear the word artificial, we hear it in terms of nutrition or food. We hear that this drink is sweetened with artificial flavors or artificial sweeteners. And what artificial means in modern circles is usually not natural. It's not natural, it's artificial. This is not my real leg. I have an artificial leg. It means fake. That's what we usually mean in modern society when we say the word artificial. But that's not what it means here. The word artificial the second half of this word comes from the Latin word facio, which means I make. Artificial means made by art. It means man-made, artificial. So the road outside your house, in this sense, is artificial. It's not a natural road. It's an artificial road. Men cleared the path. Men put down stone and pavement. They painted lines on it. You drive your car on an artificial road, a man-made road, a road that is made by human art. Your house is artificial. It was made by man. It was produced by the arts of carpentry and plumbing and concrete pouring and on and on. Your house is artificial. The street that you drive on is artificial. My clothing is artificial. It's man-made. It's made by human art. And so Aristotle says credibility is the only artificial part of the art of rhetoric. And what he means by that is when we study and get into this art of rhetoric, there's really only one part that concerns us. There's really only one part that we can study and practice effectively. Only one part that's actually artificial or that can be accomplished by means of art, and that is credibility. Credibility is the only part of the art of rhetoric that is artificial, that we can actually carry out and accomplish by means of art. So studying what allows us to speak credibly, what allows us to achieve credibility is the real focus of the true art of reasoning. And Aristotle complains that the men in his day who were writing books and teaching on this art were not dealing with credibility, which is the real focus, or should be the real focus of this art. He says credibility is the only artificial part of the art, but the other parts are additions. The other parts are just extras. The real focus of the art of rhetoric should be credibility. And he goes on to say, the rhetoricians of the present day, that is, of his day, the rhetoricians of the present day say nothing about enthymemes. Rhetoricians of the present day, of Aristotle's day, he says, say nothing about enthymemes. And the fact that you have no idea what this word means is proof that rhetoricians of our day don't say anything about enthymemes either. What are enthymemes? That's a question that you need to make sure as we go through all of these things. These are the questions that we want to answer through our study of rhetoric. What are enthymemes? Aristotle says, enthymemes are the substantial part of credibility. In other words, without enthymemes, there is no credibility. If we want to learn this art, whereby we learn how to achieve credibility, Aristotle tells us the substance of that art is found in enthymemes. And so we need to learn what enthymemes are in the study of rhetoric. Enthymemes are the substantial part of credibility, but their attention, that is, other rhetoricians, their attention is for the most part directed to things that are foreign to the purpose. Distractions, other issues. What should I wear when I speak publicly? What should I think about when I look at the audience? How should I project my voice? How should I speak? What should I do with my hands? How should I stand? What should my posture be? He says all of these concerns are foreign to the purpose. How can I persuade someone? How can I cause someone to have an emotional reaction to what I say? Those things are all foreign to the purpose. They do not pertain to the substance of this art, which is credibility, which is carried out by enthymemes. Their attention is for the most part directed to things foreign to the purpose. For accusation, pity, anger, and such like passions of the soul do not pertain to the thing itself, but to the judge. The judge, in some speeches, is the audience. A person is speaking to try and draw a certain reaction from the judge. That's the judge's business. That's not the business of the speaker, to try and draw out these emotions. If all judicial processes were conducted in the same manner as they are at present in some cities, and especially in those that are governed by good laws, these rhetoricians would not have anything to say. In other words, those who manipulate, those who abuse this art of public speaking, those who abuse things like a court case where arguments are heard by a judge or jury and try to take advantage of that and manipulate. Those who do the same in political circles, say in democracy, who try and take advantage of the fact that the people are going to vote and the people may not be educated. Those who try to take advantage of those situations. In a state with good laws, Aristotle says, they wouldn't even be allowed to speak because the things that they do and the things that they say would never be allowed in a courtroom. The people would never allow them to do those things. And so those arts can only be practiced, what these other rhetoric teachers actually teach, they can only be practiced in places where there are no laws. But we're seeking to study the true art of rhetoric, which is going to be practiced in a wisely governed city where this kind of nonsense is not even allowed. With respect to all cities, some think it necessary that the laws should thus ordain. But this method is adopted by others, and they forbid rhetoricians to say anything foreign to the purpose. In the same manner as in the Areopagus, which was an ancient an ancient place for discussion and disputes in Athens. We can read about the Areopagus in the New Testament in Acts chapter 17, because St. Paul actually speaks in the Areopagus in Acts chapter 17. In this respect, they think rightly, for it is not proper to pervert the judge. Our interest is never to mislead someone, to bring about our desired end. We don't want to simply win the case, even if what we're representing is falsehood. We're assuming in our study that we're interested in being good men first. We're not interested in an art of rhetoric that serves the interests of evil men. Our interest is not to pervert the judgment of the judge or to simply lead the people according to our will. And in a good city, we won't be allowed to do those things. It is not proper to pervert the judge by exciting him to anger or envy or pity, that is, playing with his emotions, since this is just as if someone should make the rule distorted which he intends to use. Again, it is likewise manifest that the only business of the litigant, the only business of one making a case or arguing in a court, the only business of the litigant is to show that a thing either is or is not, or that it has or has not been done. But with respect to such things as the legislator, the lawmaker, has not defined, whether they are great or small, just or unjust, these ought to be known by the judge himself. And he is not to learn them from the litigants. That is, the judge should be a master of all of these questions of politics and laws. He should not allow someone to tell him how he should think about a certain issue or what should be done. The litigants in a case, their job is simply to prove whether something that a person is accused of has been done or hasn't been done. That's all that they're there to do. They're not there to tell the judge what he should think or what he should do, what he should feel, and so on. In a good city, the legislators, the lawmakers, will clarify all of these things in advance and not leave these questions open to the judge so that the judge cannot be manipulated by those speaking. And so Aristotle is explaining that there's more to this than just the arguments. We also need to consider politics and lawmaking and need to make sure that we protect our courts and protect the people from the opportunities where manipulators can get in and pervert the judge and mislead the people. These things can be controlled by the laws in a city. With respect to such things as the legislator, the lawmaker, has not defined, the law is not detailed enough, the judge should know these things. And he is not to learn them from the people arguing in the case. It is especially requisite, therefore, that laws which are rightly framed should define all such particulars as can be defined, and leave very little to be defined by the judge. In the first place, this is requisite because it is more easy to obtain one person or a few than many that are intelligent and wise, who are able to act the part of a legislator and a judge. If we leave the laws vague in a city or in a country, and we then ask the judges to make the decisions, but the laws are vague and unclear, and they leave a lot to be decided by the judge, then we would need to find wise men for every single courtroom so that the judge could be a wise and just man. And wise and just men are not common. So setting up a state that depends on wise and just judges be seated in every single court is not a good plan. Aristotle argues that what should be done is the state should have a detailed law written and published that tries to foresee all of the situations that may arise and allow one or a few wise men make those detailed laws that takes power away from judges, so that we're not dependent on judges, and so that the judges can't be manipulated, because they're not given much room to do much other than to judge a specific case according to the detailed laws that have already been written by wise and just men. In the next place, the establishment of laws is the effect of a survey from a long series of past time. But judgments made by a judge are the result of a survey from recent times, so that it is difficult for those who judge to attribute what is just and advantageous in a becoming manner. In other words, when you put a judge on the spot, it's difficult for a person to make a decision on the spot in a specific case where the details are emerging. And we can avoid that because lawmaking allows us to make decisions to anticipate events based on hundreds or thousands of years of human experience, which are called precedents, and to write laws with sufficient detail to help judges make decisions in specific cases by giving them general principles, laws that are universal and apply to many different situations, which the judges then simply apply to particular cases. It's difficult to make decisions on the spot with emerging evidence. It's much easier if those situations are anticipated by lawmakers, and that pressure is taken away from the judge. That, however, which is the greatest reason of all, is that the judgment of the legislator, and I already mentioned this, the judgment of the legislator is not conversant with particular details of specific circumstances, but with future events and with universals, that is, with principles that apply to all different cases and circumstances. The judgment of the barrister and the judge is directed to present and definite or specific circumstances, with which love and hatred, private advantage are frequently conjoined. That is, present circumstances often affect us personally and directly, and it's hard to judge with a detached heart according to justice when the issues that are being discussed are present and affect us personally. In order for justice to be fair and to be freed from emotions in those making judgments, it's better to have laws that are written outside of those events and separate from the circumstances so that emotions don't enter in. The judgment of the barrister and judge is directed to present circumstances with which love and hatred and private advantage are often conjoined, so that they are no longer sufficiently able to survey the truth, but their own peculiar pleasure or pain darkens their judgment. Their own peculiar pleasure or pain, that is what they have to gain or lose personally, influences and darkens their judgment. It's what allows a judge to be bribed. It's what leads a judge to make a false decision. He's not listening to the case and judging impartially. He's listening to the case, but then he's thinking about how the outcome will affect him personally, and that affects his judgment. Aristotle's argument, we can't allow courts to be set up like that with pressure on the judges, where their judgment can be darkened by present circumstances and pressures and personal benefits. With respect to other particulars, therefore, it is necessary, as we have said, that very little should be left in the power of the judge. But with respect to the enquiry whether a thing has been done or has not been done, or whether it will or will not take place, or is not, it is necessary that this should be left to the judges. For it is not possible that these things, whether a certain person has done something or not, that can't be foreseen by the legislator. The lawmaker doesn't know whether a specific person in a specific case has murdered someone or not. The lawmaker can't judge the cases. It's all based on evidence. But the lawmaker can take away all of the other factors that allow a judge's decision to be altered or manipulated. Not just by the person speaking, but also by the interests of the judge himself. Now, just before we go on any further, you may listen to all this and say, wait a minute, I thought we were talking about the art of rhetoric. I thought we were talking about an art that applies to all human lives and is of interest to all men. And why are we talking about judges and courts and lawyers and courtrooms? I thought this was a general study. It is a general study. This is simply one application where the problems of rhetoric and their solutions are being explained. He's using judges and courts and laws to show the kinds of problems that exist and how they relate to the art of rhetoric. We can apply the same ideas to other areas. We can talk about parents raising children. And when children are arguing or there's controversies in a family and the father has to make a decision, we can talk about whether or not the father is able to make a just and impartial decision, or whether all of his decisions are influenced by his own selfish desires. It's the same problem. And so if a man wants to manage his household justly, how can he ensure that controversies and conflicts and arguments are settled fairly in the household? And the answer is he can subject himself and his entire household to a higher law. For example, the teachings of the church or sacred scripture. And everyone in the house can know what the laws are, can know what the rules are, what the standards are. And even the judge, even the head of the household, can be subject to a higher law. And that's how justice can be served. And so when kids are arguing and fighting, the father can say, look, this isn't my decision. I can only do what God says to do or what the church says to do. This isn't my teaching. This is God's teaching, or this is the church's teaching. My question is simply what the details are in this specific argument. Who's telling the truth? What evidence there is to apply these rules to this situation. But don't start trying to persuade me and manipulate me to just give my opinion or my judgment, because we're all subject to a higher law. So it shows how lawmaking and justice relate to one another. And that applies to all situations, not just the judge in a courtroom. Okay, so there is a universal application, and Aristotle is just giving a specific example to highlight and show the problems. Let's keep going. If this be the case, Aristotle says, it is evident that those rhetoricians who define other parts of an oration other than credibility, such, for instance, as what the proem or the narration should contain. The word that he says there is proem, or narration. What he's referring to here is if I were to say, what should I do when I give a speech? What should I say? Well, the ancient orators the ancient orators had a certain structure or format for a speech. And there were 4 or 5 or 6 different parts of a speech. And they would study how the speech was to be composed and prepared and delivered. The proem was like the introduction. The narration was where someone explained the details of the events of the situation in question. So we can talk about the different parts of an actual speech. And this is what modern teachers do in writing classes. When they teach you how to write an essay, they say, well, you start with the introduction, and then there should be 3 paragraphs, and then a conclusion. That's all outside the point. The students don't know how to make good arguments. The students don't know what credibility is. They haven't studied the art of reasoning. So it doesn't matter that you can tell them how to make an introduction or that they should make 3 arguments. The problem is they don't know how to make arguments. And so we're missing the whole point, talking about structure, having teachers give grades because the kids followed the right structure. They followed the instructions for how to write an essay, but they don't know how to reason. They don't know how to make arguments. That's the essential part of this work. Credibility, persuasiveness, understanding how to reason, how to prove things. The students don't learn that. And instead they're talking about how many paragraphs, how many pages, and things like that. What size font should I use? What should the spacing be between the lines? When I write a list of the works that I've referenced, what's the right format for writing the references? All of these things are outside the purpose. None of these things address the real problem, which is learning how to communicate credibly, how to achieve credibility. These things are all outside the purpose. These men exercise their art in things foreign to the purpose. For in these they effect or accomplish nothing else except delivering the method by which the judge may be influenced. But they demonstrate nothing respecting artificial credibility. That is, credibility accomplished by the art. They don't teach how to persuade. They don't teach how to invent and communicate the persuasive arguments upon which the entire art and case depends. The same thing that was true of those orators is true today in modern writing teachers. They don't teach the kids what the kids actually need to effectively communicate. They deal with all of these external issues, all of these issues of ornamentation and structure and things like that, and they don't deal with the essential art, which is credibility. They demonstrate nothing respecting artificial credibility, namely, whence or from where someone may become enthymematic. Enthymematic, that is, whence someone will learn to possess the power of discovering artificial proofs of that which is the subject of the controversy. The substance of this art is learning, as he says here, how to discover artificial proofs of that which is the subject of the controversy. Now, by artificial proofs, he means proofs or evidence that is man-made, that the speaker discovers and brings to the argument. So, for example, in a crime, the police will investigate the scene of the crime and they'll look for evidence. They'll look, for example, for blood or for fingerprints or for pieces of clothing or for damage that's done. They'll collect all of this different evidence, take photos, collect samples, and bring all of this material evidence to the court. And the lawyers and the judges and the jury will have access to this material evidence. This is not artificial proof. This proof is brought from the crime itself, from the scene itself. The question is, what proof can the speaker discover and bring into the consideration of the case that's artificial by his own skill, by his own reason? A good example of this, and I would recommend you watch this. If you read the stories or watch the films of Sherlock Holmes, you'll see the whole point of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote those stories. The whole point is that Sherlock Holmes, by his power of deductive reasoning, which is what we're learning here, Sherlock Holmes was able to solve cases and prove cases by means of reasoning. And he would bring in all of these artificial proofs that he discovered by deductive reasoning into these cases to solve mysteries and things like that. So I recommend, to understand what Aristotle's talking about here, I recommend go on YouTube and look up old Sherlock Holmes films or read the stories of Sherlock Holmes written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And you'll see examples in this character of Sherlock Holmes of what it means to discover artificial proofs. Okay? What the speaker actually brings by his own art, by his own discovery, what he brings as sources of persuasion, artificial, man-made proofs. That's what should really be the focus of our study of speaking and writing, coming up with those artificial proofs. That's the real work. Not dressing up your talk, not using certain words, not setting up your essay in a certain way, not dressing a certain way, not talking a certain way, not having a certain posture. Ultimately, everything comes down to whether or not you are able to discover artificial proofs, to become, as Aristotle says, enthymematic, capable of producing artificial proofs. That's the real challenge of the art of rhetoric. Hence, though there is the same method respecting popular and judicial orations, different kinds of speeches in different contexts, the popular speech is better and more political than the method pertaining to contracts, yet rhetoricians of the present day are silent as to the popular method, but all of them endeavor to enfold the art pertaining to the judicial genus because it is less advantageous in popular orations to assert what is foreign to the purpose. And a popular oration is less pernicious than a judicial discussion, but is more common. For in the former, the judge decides about appropriate concerns. So nothing else is necessary than to show that the thing is as the counselor asserts it to be. In judicial processes, however, this is not sufficient, but it is requisite to pay attention to the hearer, for the decision is concerning things of a foreign nature. Hence, the judges, looking to their own advantage and regarding their own pleasure, gratify the litigants, but do not decide with justice. Hence, too, as I have before observed, in many places the law forbids anything foreign to the purpose to be said, and in these places the law is sufficiently observed by the judges themselves. Since, however, it is evident that the artificial method is conversant with credibility, but credibility is a certain demonstration. For we then especially believe in a thing when we think it is accompanied with demonstration. Demonstration means proof. And a rhetorical demonstration is an enthymeme. So here we have the definition of what an enthymeme is. An enthymeme is a rhetorical demonstration. An enthymeme is a certain kind of demonstration, a certain kind of proof, a proof that pertains to the context of rhetoric. An enthymeme is a rhetorical demonstration. And this, in short, possesses the greatest authority of all credibilities. But an enthymeme is a certain syllogism. Syllogism is another word for demonstration. An enthymeme is a certain syllogism, and it is the providence of either of the whole or of a certain part of dialectic to pay attention to every syllogism. So, how are rhetoric and dialectic said to be counterparts, or how do they reciprocate? It's because they both have to do, ultimately, they both are concerned with syllogisms. They both are concerned with syllogisms. In the study of the art of rhetoric, we learn the art of the syllogism. We focus on the actual principles and art of reasoning and how a syllogism is formed. However, in rhetoric, we're concerned with a certain kind of reasoning, a certain kind of demonstration. And that's how they're related, but at the same time, how they differ. The art of reasoning is concerned with all kinds of demonstration, all kinds of syllogisms. It is where we learn about the syllogism itself. But in rhetoric, we're also concerned with syllogisms, but a certain kind of syllogism. It is the part of dialectic to pay attention to every syllogism. This being the case, it is evident that he who is eminently capable of surveying this, namely, from what propositions and how a syllogism may be made, he will be especially enthymematic. The person who studies the art of reasoning and learns how syllogisms are made, he is the person that will become especially enthymematic, capable of rhetorical demonstrations and capable of mastering the art of rhetoric, the substance of which is credibility. The master of reasoning, of dialectic, he will be especially enthymematic. In consequence of assuming what the particulars are with which enthymemes are conversant, because he's skilled in the arts of syllogisms, and because enthymemes are a certain kind of syllogism. He who is a master of reasoning will be able to become a master of rhetoric. He who is ignorant of the art of reasoning will not be capable of mastering the substance of rhetoric, which is credibility, which is proof, discovering proofs. He will be especially enthymematic in consequence of assuming what the particulars are with which enthymemes are conversant, and what differences they possess with respect to logical syllogisms. For it is the province of the same power to perceive truth and what is similar to truth. That is, what's false but appears true, what can be deceiving, what is true and what is similar to truth, but not truth. It is in the province of the same power to perceive truth and what is similar to truth. And at the same time, men are by nature sufficiently adapted to the perception of truth. And for the most part, they obtain it. So Aristotle has an optimistic view of human nature. People usually can discern the truth. But the danger is that while men can discern truth from falsehood, there are many things that appear to be true, and appearances are ultimately the real danger for human beings. We're not deceived by obvious falsehoods. We're deceived by things that are not true, but appear to be true. That's the danger that we have to watch out for. And the man who learns the art of reasoning, he will be able to discern what is true and what is similar to the truth, but is not actually true. This is studied by Aristotle in his book titled The Sophistical Elenchi. Sophistical elenchi are arguments that appear to be true. This is what we call fallacies. Fallacies are not obvious false arguments. They're arguments that are false but appear to be true. They are sophistical arguments. Men by nature are sufficiently adapted to the perception of truth, and for the most part obtain it. Hence, he who sagaciously conjectures probabilities is disposed similarly to him who perceives truth. That others, therefore, artificially discuss things foreign to this purpose, and why they especially incline to judicial precepts is evident from what has been said. This one sentence here may be a little confusing. He who sagaciously conjectures probabilities is disposed similarly to him who perceives the truth. All that he's saying there is, again, this idea that he who studies and masters the art of reasoning possesses the same ability and skill that's needed to perceive what is true. And the danger, as I said, is that many times our opponents do not come at us with obvious falsehoods, but with deceiving half-truths or arguments that appear to be true, that can only be untangled by a real master of the art of reasoning. Aristotle goes on to say, rhetoric is useful because things that are true and just are naturally more excellent than their contraries. Rhetoric is useful because things that are true and just are naturally more excellent than their contraries. So that unless judgments are formed according to what is fit, what is more excellent will be vanquished by its contrary. And this is a thing worthy of reprehension. In other words, the reason why rhetoric is useful is not because it helps us to make what is false appear true. That's deception. That's sophistry. What's helpful about rhetoric is that it helps us to prevent what is false from being made to appear true. It helps us to defend what's true because what's true should always prevail. The truth should always prevail. But the truth often fails when those representing it do a poor job at representing it, and sophists are allowed to cause what is false to appear more excellent than what is actually true. And he says that's worthy of reprehension. In other words, those speakers who allow that to happen are blameworthy. They allow that to happen because by nature, what is true is more excellent than what is contrary to what is true. Farther still, though we should possess the most accurate science, it is not easy when we speak to persuade some persons by employing that science. For a scientific oration proceeds from discipline, and it is impossible from this to persuade the unlearned. Let me explain what that means real quick. When Aristotle refers to a science, he's talking about some systematic science of a certain subject. For example, the art of geometry or the science of natural philosophy. It's impossible for us to use proofs that we learn through different sciences, through discipline, which means study. So if I study the art of arithmetic, if I study the art of geometry, the art of music, of arithmetic, of astronomy, if I study the art of, or the science of natural philosophy or moral philosophy, and I learn through careful study, I learn proofs from these different sciences, and I become persuaded of different principles through these different sciences. I can't take those principles and now bring them to the common people and use them as proofs. Scientific proofs, that is, proofs that are drawn from sciences which have to be studied and learned, can't be used to persuade the unlearned. A scientific oration, a speech that depends on principles that are learned in a disciplined scientific study, we cannot use these to persuade the unlearned or those who have not studied those sciences. But it is necessary to procure credibility and frame arguments from such things as are common. It's necessary for us to learn how to discover proofs, how to argue, not from proofs and principles that come from sciences that we've studied, but from things that are common. Just as we have asserted in the Topics. And you see here that Aristotle refers to his work on the Topics as the place where he teaches this. Respecting a conference with the multitude, that is, with the common people. We often see Christians guilty of this because theology, catechism, scripture study, and so on are a kind of science. St. Thomas Aquinas teaches in the opening of the Summa Theologica that theology is a science. And one of the problems in common discussions, the work of evangelization, which is to go into the world, that is to go in among the multitude, as Aristotle says, and make disciples, persuade them, teach them, and lead them to the Christian faith. One of the problems is that we bring doctrines and principles from these sciences, which we've become persuaded of by a number of different means. We bring them to common people and present them to them as if they're proofs, and they're not proofs to the unlearned, to the common people, to people who don't share our experiences, to people who haven't studied what we've studied, who don't have the graces that we have. To take those arguments and bring them to the unconverted, the unlearned, is irrational and ineffective. We have to learn how to persuade using common arguments. And this is studied in the Topics, in dialectical reasoning. Farther still, Aristotle says, the power of being able to persuade contraries, the ability to dispute on each side of a question, to exercise ourselves on both sides of a question. That is the work of disputation. Whether we're doing it through exercises, arguing with other people, or simply exercising ourselves in our own studies and meditations. The power of being able to persuade contraries, to argue both sides of a question, is necessary in the same manner as in syllogisms. In other words, this is another way that rhetoric is like dialectic, because we need to exercise ourselves in arguing both sides of questions. Not in order that we may actually do both, not so that we can just, act like a hired attorney who's willing to argue any case for the sake of his client's money. Not that we're interested in actually going out and arguing something that we know is contrary to the truth to win a certain case or a certain vote or whatever. We're not interested in actually arguing what is false. Like playing the devil's advocate is an exercise in reasoning. But we're not interested in actually going and being the devil's advocate in real affairs. But it's a practice that needs to be learned and engaged in, both in rhetoric and in the art of reasoning. Not that we may actually do both, for it is not proper to persuade to what is base. It's not proper to actually be the devil's advocate in a real case or in a real argument, to knowingly take up a false cause and simply be employed to win an argument or sell something or lead someone to a certain position that you know is not true. That's never proper to do that. And that's not what rhetoric is. But it is necessary for us to be able to do so, to understand, to anticipate both sides of an argument. We see this in the Summa Theologica, where St. Thomas anticipates objections. Whether he's actually received those objections or not, we don't necessarily know whether anyone has actually made those arguments to St. Thomas, or whether St. Thomas has simply thought about them in his own meditation and study and has proposed them as anticipated objections and then resolved them. That's the work that Aristotle is talking about, not thinking of false arguments or how to defend a false position for the sake of actually using that to persuade someone of something false. It is not proper to persuade to what is base, but that we may not be ignorant how contraries subsist, and that when another person employs those arguments unjustly, we may be able to solve them or refute them, because we understand them, because we exercise ourselves in those false arguments. And when they come, we're able to explain where they fail and solve them. No one of the other arts syllogistically concludes contraries. None of the other arts do this except for rhetoric and reasoning or dialectic. This alone is effected by dialectic and rhetoric, for both of them are conversant with or interested in contraries. Though the things which are the subjects of their consideration do not subsist similarly, the word subsist just means exist, but always, as I may say, things which are true are naturally more excellent and more syllogistic and adapted to procure persuasion. It's easier to persuade with the truth, and that's why the truth should always prevail. The person who represents the truth has an advantage in every argument, and he should win unless he causes what is true to appear less excellent than what is its contrary. Things which are true and naturally more excellent are more syllogistic and adapted to procure persuasion. Besides, it is absurd that it should be shameful for a man not to be able to give assistance to his body, and that it should not be shameful for not to be able to assist himself by the reasoning power, which is more the peculiarity of the man than the use of his body. In other words, if a man can't help himself physically, we would look at that man in a shameful way. And yet when we look around, we find people cannot help themselves rationally. And we don't treat men with the same criticism, that this should be considered shameful, that you're not able to help yourself rationally by being able to discern and defend what is true, when it's more natural for what is true to procure persuasion, and you allow yourself to fail because you're not able to help yourself by the use of well-trained and exercised reason. It's shameful. It's reprehensible. If, however, it should be objected that he who uses unjustly the rhetorical power may injure others in a great degree, this objection is common to everything that is good. In other words, if people are going to complain that we shouldn't study rhetoric because rhetoric could be misused, the same is true of anything. That's not a legitimate objection. The same is true of everything that is good except virtue, and especially to the most useful things, such as strength. Strength can be misused. Health can be abused. Riches can be misused. Military command can be misused. All of those things are good. All of those things are to be pursued, and yet they're all capable of abuse and misuse. He who uses things of this kind justly may benefit others in the greatest degree, and by using them unjustly may effect the greatest injury. That's a risk that we always have to be willing to take. Good things may always be abused and used to do evil. The same is true of rhetoric. So if anyone objects to the study of rhetoric because it can be misused, the same is true of any good thing. That rhetoric, therefore, is not conversant with one certain definite genus of things or class of things, but resembles in this respect dialectic, and that it is useful, is evident. It is likewise evident that the employment of rhetoric is not to persuade. Pay attention to that. The employment of rhetoric is not to persuade, but to perceive on every subject what is adapted to procure persuasion. That's the important difference I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. The purpose of the study of rhetoric is not simply to persuade, but here's what it actually is. The employment of rhetoric is not to persuade, but to perceive on every subject what is adapted to procure persuasion, in the same manner as in all other arts. For it is not the business of medicine to produce health. A doctor is not judged based on whether or not a patient that he serves regains his health, because it's not in the doctor's control. It is not the business of medicine to produce health, but to do everything possible which may procure health. That's the doctor's responsibility, to do everything possible which may procure health. That is, to know what all possible causes of diseases and their remedies are. That's the test of a true physician, not whether or not he actually causes a person to recover, because that's not in the physician's control. The healing art may be well exercised upon those that are incapable of being restored to health. In addition to what has been said, it is the province of the same power to perceive what is persuasive and what appears to be so, but is not. Just as it is the province of dialectic to discern what is a true and what only an apparent or sophistical syllogism. For the sophistical art does not consist in the power of reasoning. It's not actually the art of reasoning, what sophists or deceivers do, but in deliberate choice, that is, in simply affecting the choices made by people through deliberation. Except that here, in the rhetorical art, one man will be a rhetorician from science, but the other a sophistical rhetorician from deliberate choice. There, in dialectic or logic, the sophist is from deliberate choice, but the logician is not from deliberate choice, but from the power of reasoning. So in both dialectic or reasoning and in rhetoric, you have the man who argues the truth, who represents the true art of rhetoric or the true art of reasoning. And then you have his opponent, which is not a man who just talks nonsense and falsehood, but a man who studies to present what is false so that it appears to be true. This is the case in rhetoric. This is also the case in reasoning. Now, the place where we learn to discern the sophistical arguments, as I said, is in a book written by Aristotle titled Sophistical Arguments. It's the last book of Aristotle's series on the arts of reasoning. And so we see, that's the end of this first chapter, we see what it means for rhetoric and dialectic to be reciprocal or counterparts. We see that they're alike in a number of different ways. That last paragraph summarizes the ways in which dialectic and rhetoric are similar to one another. They both apply to issues that are of interest to all men. They're not interested in a specific science. They both pertain to credibility and proof. Rhetoric is concerned primarily with enthymemes, which are a certain kind of demonstration or proof, a certain kind of syllogism. And the reason why these two arts can't be separated is because the man who studies the art of the syllogisms or the proofs is the man who is capable of achieving credibility in the art of reasoning. So that's all for chapter 1. That's a lot of information. I trust that that's a helpful guide through your first reading and exposition of chapter 1 of Aristotle's Rhetoric. It's time now for you to study this chapter for mastery. It's a very important chapter with a lot of information. You can watch this video as many times as you'd like to go through all the details. If there's anything in there that you don't feel that I explained clearly or you'd like to discuss a little bit more, get in touch with me and I'll go into it deeper with you. Maybe even make additional videos to clarify things that need more attention. But that should be a good guide for you through your first reading of Aristotle's Rhetoric. If you have any questions, get in touch. God bless your studies.